The first thing the witnesses remembered wasn't the fear, it was the noise. It started with a single crack, sharp and dry, like a branch snapping in a winter forest. But before the echo could even bounce off the hills, the world simply tore apart. It was June 22nd, 1887, Morehead, Kentucky. If you were standing on Main Street that morning, you wouldn't have been able to hear your own screams. The air was instantly replaced by the roar of 60 Winchester rifles firing in unison. This wasn't the rhythmic pop, pop, pop of a Hollywood duel. This was a wall of sound, a continuous deafening thunder rolling down from the bushes and slamming into the facade of the Central Hotel. Windows shattered instantly, cascading glass onto the boardwalk. The wood siding didn't just splinter, it evaporated, turned into sawdust by thousands of rounds of ammunition pummeling the building from every angle. Inside the hotel, men scrambled across the floor, pressing their faces into the dirty floorboards as the walls around them turned into Swiss cheese. Bullets weren't just coming through the windows, they were punching through the timber, through the furniture, ripping through the very structure of the room. For 2 solid hours, the town of Morehead ceased to be a place where people lived. It became a kill box. The smoke from the black powder grew so thick that the sun was blotted out. A grey, choking fog settled over the street, smelling of sulphur and burnt wood. And in that fog, flashes of orange light flickered like lightning in a storm cloud. But here is the detail that makes this story truly insane. Usually, in the history of the American frontier, this is the part where the brave lawmen surround the bandits. We are used to the image of the sheriff pinning the star to his chest and leading a posse to root out the criminals hiding in the saloon. But on this hot June morning, the roles were completely reversed. The men hiding inside the hotel, cowering under tables and praying for the shooting to stop, they were the law. The man leading them held the title of police judge. His deputies were sworn officers. They held the warrants. They held the authority. And the men outside, the ones raining hellfire down on the hotel, they were the outlaws, the exiles, the ones who had been stripped of their rights and chased out of town. This brings us to a terrifying question, one that I want you to hold on to for this entire story. We are taught that the law is the good guy, that the badge represents order. But what happens when the badge is pinned to the chest of a monster? What happens when the law decides to use its power not to protect, but to hunt? On that day in 1887, the people of Morehead decided they had an answer. They decided that when the law becomes a weapon, the only justice left is a loaded rifle. But before we can understand how a quiet Kentucky town turned into a war zone, we have to understand the man who made it necessary. A man who thought he could own a county until the county decided to own him. To understand this story, you have to delete the image of the Wild West from your mind. Forget the scorching deserts of Arizona, forget the tumbleweeds of Texas, forget Tombstone. This horror story didn't happen on the frontier. It happened in the lush, green heart of the East. Morehead, Kentucky, sits in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. It is a place of dense forests, running water, and ancient hills that shadow the valleys below. In the 1880s, this should have been a paradise. The Civil War was over. The railroad had arrived. Civilization was supposed to be here. But if you stepped off the train in Morehead in 1886, you wouldn't feel peace. You would feel eyes on you. The town felt less like a community and more like a prison yard where the guards had gone on lunch break. Permanently. Men didn't walk down the center of the street, they hugged the walls. You didn't sit with your back to the door in the tavern. And on Sundays, the church pews weren't just filled with Bibles, they were filled with pistols tucked into waistbands. Journalists from New York and Chicago started calling this region the dark and bloody ground. And they weren't exaggerating. In a county with a population of just a few thousand, there had been 20 murders in 3 years. And here is the statistic that freezes your blood. Out of those 20 murders, there had been exactly 0 convictions. Not one person had gone to jail. Why? Because the jury box was just as dangerous as the street. If you voted guilty against the wrong family, you wouldn't make it home for supper. This chaos wasn't random. It was the result of a power vacuum known as the Rowan County War. History books will try to tell you this was a feud, like the Hatfields and McCoys. They'll show you family trees that look like tangled fishing line. But let's simplify it. This wasn't about family honor. This was about power. On one side, you had the Martin family, the old establishment. They were the political favorites. On the other side, you had the Tolliver family, the aggressive newcomers who wanted that power for themselves. It started the way these things always start. A drunken argument on election day in 1884, a fistfight that turned into a knife fight, which turned into a gunfight. By the time the smoke cleared, a Solomon Bradley was dead. But in Kentucky, blood demands interest. For the next 3 years, it was a slow-motion tennis match of violence. The Martins would ambush a Tolliver. The Tollivers would burn down a Martin barn. The Martins would snipe a deputy. The Tollivers would raid a home. It was a cycle of an eye for an eye that was rapidly leaving the whole town blind. The governor of Kentucky was helpless. He sent the militia, but the moment the soldiers left, the shooting started again. The local sheriff was too terrified to act. The judges were in someone's pocket. The town of Morehead was screaming for a strong leader, someone who could end the chaos, someone who could restore order. And as often happens in history, when people beg for order, they usually get a tyrant. Out of the smoke and the misery, a man stepped forward. He had a plan to end the feud. He promised to bring peace to Rowan County. But he didn't mention that his version of peace looked a lot like a graveyard. His name was Craig Tolliver, and he was the devil the town had prayed for. When you look at his photograph, you don't see a wild-eyed killer. You see a man with a neatly trimmed mustache, a calm, cold stare, and clothes that look like they came from a catalogue. He looks more like a banker than a warlord, and that was his genius. Craig Tolliver understood that true power wasn't about who was fastest with a gun. It was about who wrote the laws. While the Martin family was busy with ambushes in the woods, Tolliver was busy shaking hands in town. He was charismatic. He was intelligent. He promised to clean up the streets. And in a town desperate for an end to the violence, his words sounded like salvation. So in 1885, Craig Tolliver, the leader of one of the two warring factions, did something brilliant. He got himself elected police judge of Morehead. Imagine that for a second. The leader of the mob was now the man in the judge's chair. Suddenly, the feud wasn't a 50-50 fight anymore. It was a state-sanctioned hunting party. Craig Tolliver had discovered a cheat code for murder, one that was perfectly legal. Here is how it worked. Say one of the Martins or their allies, the Logan family, got into a public argument, a minor offense. Tolliver, sitting in his judge's office, would sign an arrest warrant for disturbing the peace. Then he would hand that warrant to his deputies, who were, of course, his own cousins and gang members. Armed with a legal document, the Tolliver gang would go to serve the warrant. A few hours later, they would return and report that the suspect had tragically been killed while resisting arrest. Case closed. No investigation, no trial, just a clean, legal execution. What could the Martins do? Complain to the judge? The judge was the one who signed the order. Go to the sheriff? The sheriff was terrified of Tolliver. Craig Tolliver had turned the machinery of justice into his personal assassination bureau. The town fell silent. The open warfare stopped, replaced by something much worse, a quiet, suffocating terror. The violence wasn't gone. It had just been given a badge and a gavel. People who were once outspoken against the Tollivers now stared at the ground when Craig walked by. The click of his boots on the boardwalk was the only sound on the street. He had brought peace to Morehead, the peace of a graveyard. He had total control. He was untouchable. But for a man like Craig Tolliver, control isn't enough. He wanted more. He wanted total submission. And he was about to make a demand so extreme, so tyrannical, that it would finally push his enemies past their breaking point. He was about to sign an order that would turn them from victims into hunters. It wasn't enough to win. It wasn't enough to rule. Craig Tolliver wanted to erase his enemies from the map. He knew that as long as a single Martin or Logan remained in Rowan County, they were a spark that could reignite the war. So he decided to extinguish them for good, not with a bullet, but with a piece of paper. Sometime in late 1886, he summoned the remaining heads of the rival faction. They met not in a dark alley, but in a public space. This was not a backroom deal. This was a decree. He laid out the terms of their surrender. But it wasn't a surrender. It was an eviction notice for their own lives. The deal was simple. Leave Rowan County. Sell your land, likely to Tolliver's allies for pennies on the dollar. Pack your belongings and never come back. If any of them were found within the county lines after the deadline, Tolliver made it clear that a warrant would be issued. And everyone knew what happened when a Tolliver warrant was served. This was more than just a threat. It was a psychological masterpiece of cruelty. You have to understand what he was asking. These were not newcomers. Their families had lived in those hills for generations. This wasn't just land. This was the soil their grandfathers had plowed, the creeks where they had been baptized, the homes where their children were born. Their very identity was tied to that ground. Being a Logan of Rowan County meant something. Being a Martin meant something. And now, Craig Tolliver was telling them that their existence was illegal. Imagine a man standing in your living room, holding a piece of paper, and telling you that your home, your history, your entire life in this place is finished. You can leave, or you can die. What choice did they have? To stay meant certain death, legally sanctioned by the man who made the laws. To fight back seemed impossible. Tolliver had the guns, the badges, and the courts. So, they broke. One by one, the families of the Martin Logan faction loaded their life's possessions into wagons. They sold their farms for almost nothing. They said goodbye to the graves of their ancestors. The town watched in silence as a sad caravan of the defeated rolled out of Morehead. Tolliver and his men likely stood on the boardwalk, watching them go, a smug sense of victory on their faces. He thought it was over. He thought he had finally won the Rowan County War. But he had made a classic mistake. The mistake every tyrant eventually makes. He had taken everything from these men. Their homes, their dignity, their future. And when you take everything from a man, you leave him with nothing left to lose. The exiles scattered to the winds. Some went to neighboring counties, others crossed state lines, finding work where they could, living with relatives, trying to piece together a shattered life. They were broken men, all except one. His name was Boone Logan. He was a cousin of the Martins, a man known for being quiet, thoughtful, and relentlessly stubborn. Craig Tolliver had taken his home, but he had failed to take his will. While the others were mourning, Boone Logan was calculating. He understood a fundamental truth. You cannot reason with a tyrant. You cannot appeal to his morality. You can only speak to him in the one language he understands, overwhelming force. In the spring of 1887, Boone Logan took a train to Cincinnati. To anyone watching, he looked like any other Kentucky farmer heading to the big city for supplies. A trip to the bank, a visit to the hardware merchants, perhaps a new plow for a future that for him no longer existed. But Boone Logan didn't go to the bank, and he didn't go to the hardware store. He walked into one of the largest firearms distributors in the Midwest. He wasn't there for plows. He was there for something that sows a very different kind of harvest. We don't know the exact conversation that took place, but we know the result. Boone Logan placed an order that would have made a small army proud. He didn't buy a handful of pistols for self-defense. He bought 60 brand new, state-of-the-art Winchester Model 1873 repeating rifles. The gun that won the West. A weapon known for its reliability and rapid-fire capability. And he didn't just buy the rifles. He bought the ammunition, crates of it, thousands upon thousands of rounds. This was a declaration of war, signed not with ink, but with a bank draft. Think about the sheer scale of this. This wasn't a man planning a duel. This was a general equipping a battalion. The cost must have been astronomical, likely draining every last cent the exiled families had scraped together. It was an all-or-nothing bet. The rifles and ammunition were carefully packed into unmarked crates. Labeled as hardware or farm equipment, they were loaded onto a train heading back towards the hills of Kentucky. Boone Logan had secured the tools for his revenge. The cold steel and brass were stacked and ready, but guns don't fire themselves. Now came the most dangerous part of the plan. He had the weapons. Now he had to go find the ghosts who would carry them. The crates of rifles arrived not in Morehead, but at a small, discreet train station miles away. They were unloaded in the dead of night and disappeared into the hills, carried by pack mules along forgotten trails. The weapons were hidden. The second phase of the plan began. Word went out. Not by telegraph, which could be read by anyone. Not by letters, which could be intercepted. It went out by whispers. A trusted cousin would ride for 2 days to a farm in a neighboring state, deliver a coded message, and ride back. A friend would pass a note in a crowded market. A single word spoken to the right person in a tavern was all it took. The message was simple. It's time. Imagine receiving that message. You've spent months trying to build a new life. You have a new job, a new routine. You've tried to forget the humiliation, the anger, the loss. And then, a man you haven't seen in a year appears at your door, his face grim. He tells you the rifles are here. He tells you the time is now. This was the moment of truth. To go back was to risk everything. Not just your life in the coming fight, but your freedom. If they were caught, Craig Tolliver would have them all in his jail and on his gallows before the week was out. But one by one, the men made their choice. They kissed their wives goodbye, telling them they were going on a hunting trip. They told their employers they were sick. They packed a bag with nothing but some dried food and their resolve. And they began to walk home. They moved like phantoms, traveling only at night. They avoided roads and towns, sticking to the deep woods and the high ridges of the Appalachians. They were men who knew this land like the back of their hand. They knew the creeks, the caves, the hidden paths that Tolliver's deputies would never find. Slowly, silently, the army of the exiled began to form. They gathered in small groups at pre-arranged meeting points, an abandoned cabin, a hidden rock formation, a clearing deep in the forest. These weren't soldiers following orders. They were ghosts coming home to haunt the man who had banished them. By the night of June 21st, the woods surrounding Morehead held a secret. 60 armed men were positioned in the hills, looking down on the town that had cast them out. They could see the lights in the windows, the smoke rising from the chimneys. They could see the central hotel where Craig Tolliver was likely sleeping, convinced of his absolute power. He had no idea that the ghosts of Rowan County had returned, and that they were waiting for the sun to rise. The sun rose over the Appalachian hills on June 22nd, casting long shadows across the valley. The town of Morehead woke up slowly, just as it did every other day. The blacksmith's hammer began its steady rhythm down the street. A shopkeeper came out to sweep his porch. The smell of wood smoke and coffee started to drift through the morning air. It was a picture of perfect, rural peace. Inside the Central Hotel, Craig Tolliver was enjoying the spoils of his victory. He sat at a table in the saloon, leaning back in his chair, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The morning light streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. He was surrounded by his lieutenants, men like Wiley Day and Hiram Rayborn. They were laughing, talking politics, planning their day. They were relaxed, confident, untouchable. Why wouldn't they be? Their enemies were gone. The town was theirs. The law was in their pocket. Craig Tolliver had no reason to believe this day would be any different from the last 100 days. He had won. He was a king in his castle, completely unaware that his kingdom was already surrounded. Every person who appeared on the street that morning was watched. Every window, every rooftop, every clump of bushes on the surrounding hills concealed a pair of eyes, staring down the sight of a Winchester rifle. The 60 men of the posse had crept into their positions under the cover of darkness. They were a silent, invisible ring of death, tightening around the center of the town. They watched the blacksmith. They watched the shopkeeper. They watched the front door of the Central Hotel, and they waited. They were waiting for the signal, waiting for the town to get a little busier, so their targets would be more relaxed, waiting for the perfect moment when Craig Tolliver and his men presented themselves. The air in Morehead was calm, but the air in the hills was electric with anticipation. For every laugh inside the saloon, there was a silent prayer being whispered in the trees. For every clink of a whiskey glass, there was the cold, hard feel of a finger resting on a trigger. The peace was a lie. The entire town was a stage, and the curtain was about to rise on the final act. Every successful ambush is a masterclass in geography, and the men hunting Craig Tolliver were masters of their terrain. Let's break down the layout of this trap, because it was brutally, terrifyingly effective. The centerpiece was the Central Hotel. It was a 2-story wooden building sitting right in the heart of Morehead, next to the railroad tracks. For Tolliver, it was his throne room, his fortress. But from a tactical perspective, it was a death trap. A flimsy wooden box with big, inviting windows on all sides. The posse didn't just surround the hotel, they occupied every single dominant firing position around it. First, you had the shooters on the hillside overlooking the town. They had the high ground. They could see into the 2nd-story windows. Nothing could move on the street below without them knowing. Second, directly across the street was the railroad depot. Its thick walls and small windows made it a perfect sniper's nest. A team of riflemen was positioned there with a clear, point-blank field of fire into the front of the hotel. Third, other shooters took up positions in the stores and buildings adjacent to the hotel. They covered the side exits and the alleyways. What they created was a 360-degree field of fire. Military strategists have a name for this. They call it a kill box. It means there is no escape. If Tolliver's men ran out the front door, they would be met by the volley from the depot. If they ran out the back, the men on the hillside would see them. If they tried to slip out a side window, the riflemen in the neighboring buildings were waiting. Every single exit was the entrance to another trap. Craig Tolliver thought he owned the town. He didn't realize he was actually standing in the center of a bullseye. His greatest strength, his visibility, his public control of the town's center, had been turned into his greatest weakness. The hunters used his arrogance against him. They knew he would be there. They knew he would feel safe. The trap wasn't just made of men and guns, it was made of psychology. All the pieces were in place. The 60 riflemen were settled, their hearts pounding in the silence. All that was needed now was for the prey to step into the open. One wrong move, one shout, one man in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the trigger for this perfectly laid trap was about to be pulled, not by a hero, but by a drunk. The tension couldn't hold forever. A wire stretched that tight is bound to snap. Around 8 in the morning, one of Tolliver's men, Hiram Rayborn, stepped out of the Central Hotel. Maybe he was going to the stables, maybe just getting some fresh air. He walked a few paces onto the boardwalk, stretching in the warm June sun. And then he froze. Something was wrong. The street was too still. The usual morning traffic of wagons and horses was gone. The windows of the shops across the street looked like dark, empty eyes. His gaze drifted to the railroad depot. He saw a flicker of movement behind a dirty pane of glass. Then, a glint of sunlight off something metallic. It wasn't a buckle, it was the barrel of a rifle. His eyes shot up to the hillside. He saw another glint, and another. The bushes weren't just bushes. They were full of men. In that single, heart-stopping second, the world shifted. The feeling of safety evaporated. The peace of the morning was revealed to be a lie. He wasn't a conqueror standing in his conquered town. He was an animal that had just realized the hunters had closed in. A wave of pure, cold adrenaline washed over him. He opened his mouth and screamed a warning back into the hotel. "Boys, we're surrounded!" But his voice was swallowed by the sound that came next. From the depot across the street, a single rifle fired. It was a sharp, piercing crack that was impossibly loud in the morning stillness. It wasn't the signal, it was a mistake. Some nervous young man on the posse, seeing Rayborn spot them, couldn't hold his nerve any longer. He had jumped the gun. For a fraction of a second there was a stunned silence. The birds stopped singing. The blacksmith's hammer stopped falling. Everyone in Morehead, both the hunters and the hunted, held their breath. The trap had been sprung too early. Inside the hotel, men who had been laughing a moment before were now scrambling, diving behind the bar, kicking over tables. And in the hills and in the buildings surrounding the hotel, 60 men understood that the time for waiting was over. That one, premature shot was the single drop of rain that comes just before the hurricane breaks. That single shot was the command, and the 60 rifles answered. What happened next is hard to describe. It wasn't a volley of gunfire. It was a single, continuous roar, a physical force that hit the town like a tidal wave. The sound of a giant tearing a sheet of canvas, a sound that went on and on and on. The front of the Central Hotel simply ceased to exist. The windows didn't just break, they atomized, turning into a fine powder of glass that was blasted back into the rooms. The wooden siding didn't hold for a second. It turned into a hailstorm of splinters, ripped from the building and thrown across the street. Bullets punched through the walls as if they were made of paper. They tore through the lobby, through the saloon, through the upstairs bedrooms. A painting of a peaceful landscape fell from the wall. A whiskey bottle behind the bar erupted in a spray of brown liquid. A chair sitting by a window suddenly exploded into kindling. For the men inside, it was like being caught in the middle of a natural disaster. There was no enemy to shoot at. There was no direction to run. The threat was everywhere at once. The air instantly filled with plaster dust, wood smoke, and the sharp, choking smell of gunpowder. You couldn't think. You couldn't hear your own thoughts. You could only feel the floorboards vibrating under your cheek as the building around you was systematically dismantled, one bullet at a time. This wasn't a fight. It was a demolition. For 3 long years, the people of Rowan County had been forced to swallow their anger and their fear. Every unjust warrant, every whispered threat, every murdered friend, they had been forced to accept it in silence. Now, that anger was coming back. It was coming back at 2,000 feet per second. The initial hurricane of lead lasted for perhaps a minute. Then it subsided. Not into silence, but into something worse. A steady, patient rhythm of destruction. The posse stopped firing in unison and began picking their targets. A shot every few seconds, then another, then a small volley. Each shot was a message. Each bullet punching through the walls was a punctuation mark. The message was clear. We are not leaving, and you are not getting out. The initial roar faded. It was replaced by a ringing in their ears and a new, more terrifying sound. The groan of the hotel itself. The building was wounded, settling under the weight of its own destruction. Inside, the air was thick with a grey fog of dust and smoke. Sunlight streamed through hundreds of new holes in the walls, creating an eerie, almost beautiful pattern of light on the floor. But this wasn't starlight. It was a map of their cage. Craig Tolliver and his men were no longer rulers. They were animals, gone to ground. They pressed their faces to the dirty floorboards, not daring to move, listening to the world outside. The continuous roar was gone, but the threat remained. Every 30 seconds or so, another shot would ring out. A single, deliberate crack. A bullet would punch through the wall above their heads, a sharp reminder that 60 men were out there, watching, waiting, patient. What could they do? Their instinct was to fight back. They were gunmen after all. One of Tolliver's deputies, adrenaline overriding his fear, crawled towards a shattered window. He raised his pistol, intending to fire back at the depot. Before he could even aim, a volley of a dozen rounds slammed into the window frame, exploding what was left of the wood into a spray of splinters that raked the ceiling. He scrambled back, his face pale, a new understanding in his eyes. They were blind. Their enemies were invisible, hidden behind cover. But they were completely exposed. To even peek through a window was to invite a death sentence. In that moment, inside that ruined saloon, all of Craig Tolliver's power dissolved into nothing. His title of police judge was meaningless. The warrants in his pocket were just paper. The law he had twisted to his own ends had been replaced by a more ancient, more absolute law, the law of the rifle. They were trapped, and their resources were bleeding out. They had pistols, a few shotguns. They were equipped for a street brawl, not a military siege. A pistol felt like a child's toy against the storm outside. Ammunition was limited. The walls that had once been their fortress were now their tomb. They weren't providing cover anymore. They were just obscuring the view of the men who were going to kill them. The minutes stretched into an hour. The patient, sporadic gunfire continued, and a new, cold realization began to dawn on Craig Tolliver. The posse wasn't trying to storm the building. They didn't have to. They were just waiting for thirst, for desperation, or for a final suicidal charge. The choice was simple, and it was impossible. Stay here and wait for the end, or run into the fire. Time inside the Central Hotel began to warp. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt like hours. The world was reduced to the space between the floorboards and the ceiling. This was no longer a battle of guns. It was a battle of nerves. Craig Tolliver, the man who had held the life and death of an entire county in his hands, was now just a man, tasting the bitter dust of his own ruined fortress. The sweat on his brow felt cold. His kingdom had shrunk to a few square feet of splintered wood. His men looked to him. Their faces, once arrogant and cruel, were now pale masks of fear. They whispered to him, their voices cracking. "What do we do, Craig? What's the plan?" He had no answer. For years, he had been the chess master, moving everyone on the board. Now, he was a king trapped in the corner, with no moves left to make. For the first time in years, the police judge was looking for a way out. But all the doors were closed. Let's examine his options. Because in that moment, he only had 3, and all of them were a different flavor of hell. Option 1, stay put, wait it out, hope the posse runs out of ammunition or patience. But this was a fantasy. The hotel was a wooden tinderbox. The posse could set it on fire at any moment and simply wait for them to burn or run out choking. Staying put was a slow, cooked death. Option 2, surrender. He could tie a white cloth to a stick and walk out with his hands up. But surrender to who? To Boone Logan? To the men whose homes he had stolen and whose families he had terrorized? He knew with absolute certainty that he would never survive to see a jail cell. Surrender was a death by 1,000 cuts. That left option 3, the gambler's choice. Run. Make a coordinated, desperate break for cover. Burst out of the building and sprint for the railroad tracks, for the trees, for anywhere that wasn't here. Most of them would fall, maybe all of them. But it was a chance. A 1 in a million chance is still better than 0. It was the only option that offered them agency, the only option that allowed them to die on their feet. Lying on the floor, listening to the groans of the dying building, Craig Tolliver made his decision. The siege had broken his power, but it had not broken his pride. He would not burn, he would not beg, he would run. The whispered order passed from man to man. Get ready. On my signal, we go. There was a silent nod. A final, desperate look exchanged between the trapped men. And then, the world erupted into motion. They didn't use the front door. That was suicide. They kicked open the back and side entrances, bursting out of the ruined hotel, not as a coordinated team, but as a panicked herd. They plunged headfirst into the thick grey gun smoke that still clung to the air. It was a self-made fog of war. For a moment, it must have felt like a godsend, a cloak of invisibility. But it was a trick, a deadly illusion. The world was reduced to shadows and noise. Flashes of orange light from the hillside, the constant deafening roar of the Winchesters, which had been patient and sporadic, now returned to its full, thunderous chorus. The men of the posse couldn't see individual targets, but they didn't need to. They saw movement. They saw dark shapes scrambling out of the smoke, and they fired. They fired at the sounds. They fired at the shadows. They filled the space between the hotel and the railroad tracks with a solid wall of lead. For Tollivers' men, it was a blind, terrifying sprint. They couldn't see where the shots were coming from. They came from everywhere at once. The ground around their feet kicked up sprays of dirt. Bullets whizzed past their ears with a sound like angry hornets. They were no longer men. They were just motion, adrenaline and instinct. The animal brain screaming one single command: run. Some men went down immediately, their desperate sprint cut short, their forms disappearing back into the smoke and dust. Others kept going, zigzagging, fueled by a terror so profound it blocked out all other thought. The hunters had been patient. They had waited for this exact moment. They had anticipated the breakout. This wasn't a surprise that caught them off guard. This was the final stage of the trap. They had fled the cage, only to find themselves running through the shooting gallery. The only question now was who, if anyone, would make it to the other side. The space between the hotel and the railroad was only about 100 yards, a short distance on a normal day. On June 22nd, it was a 100-yard dash through hell. This was the Gauntlet. For the men running it, the world shrank to a terrifying tunnel. All they could see was the goal, a line of bushes and a shallow ditch next to the tracks. Safety. The roaring of the rifles became a white noise in their ears, punctuated by the sharp zip of a bullet passing inches from their head. They didn't dare look back. They didn't dare look to the side. To look was to lose a precious fraction of a second. To look was to see a friend stumble and fall, his forward momentum carrying him face first into the dirt. Splinters flew from the wooden railroad ties as rounds slammed into them. Puffs of dust erupted from the ground around their running feet, a deadly dancing pattern showing them just how close death was at every single step. Craig Tolliver was in the middle of this chaos. He was a man used to giving orders, but now he was just another runner, his heart hammering against his ribs, his lungs burning. He was fast, he was desperate, and he was almost there. He could see the details of the bushes now, the individual leaves, the promise of shadow and cover. 10 more yards, 5 more yards. The roar of the guns seemed to be focused on him, a personal, concentrated fury. He could feel the heat of the bullets passing him. He could hear the angry buzz as they tore through the air where he had just been. He was a man running a race against 1,000 tiny, invisible pieces of lead. A race he had to win just once. They had to win just once. He dove. He lunged for the ditch, for the safety of the embankment. For a split second, it seemed like he had made it, that against all odds the king had escaped his own execution. He landed hard in the shallow ditch, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. For a single beautiful heartbeat, there was nothing but the ringing in his ears and the smell of damp earth. He was alive. He was covered. He had made it. His pistol was empty. His fingers, clumsy with adrenaline, fumbled for the cartridges in his pocket. He was focused on the mechanism of the gun, on the small brass objects that promised a chance to fight back. And in that moment, he made a mistake. He paused. For just a second, his frantic, zigzagging motion had stopped. He was a still object in a world of chaos, and through the smoke, a rifleman on the hillside finally had a clear, stationary target. It didn't feel like a bullet. There was no sharp sting. It felt like being hit with a sledgehammer. A sudden, violent, full-body impact that wasn't sharp, but deep and final. His entire body went rigid. The cartridges he was holding spilled from his hand, forgotten. The pistol slipped from his grasp, falling silently into the dirt beside him. The desperate plan to reload, to fight, to survive, it all vanished from his mind, replaced by a great, silent weight. He didn't collapse. He folded, as if a puppeteer had simply cut his strings. His knees buckled, and he settled forward, his momentum gone. There was no final cry. There were no dramatic last words, just a quiet surrender to gravity. The sound of the battle raged on around him, but for him, it was already fading into a distant echo. Craig Tolliver, the police judge, the tyrant of Rowan County, came to rest face down in the Kentucky soil he had tried to conquer. His reign, which had been built on years of fear and violence, was ended in a single, fatal pause. The fall of the king didn't immediately stop the war. The symphony of violence had its own momentum. The men of the posse, their vision obscured by smoke, continued to fire at any shadow that moved. But the heart of the resistance was gone. The breakout, which had been a desperate, unified charge, now fractured into individual acts of survival. Hiram Rayborn, the man who had first sounded the alarm, never made it more than a few feet from the hotel door. The escape he had screamed about was one he would never complete. He collapsed on the boardwalk, another casualty of the Iron Rain. Wiley Day, one of Tolliver's most trusted lieutenants, made it further. He ran the same gauntlet as his leader, his legs pumping, his eyes fixed on the promise of cover. But his luck ran out just yards from the railroad tracks. His desperate run ended abruptly, his form becoming another still shape in the smoke-filled landscape. For the few remaining members of the gang, a new reality set in. Their leader was gone. Their comrades were falling around them. The promise of escape was a lie. The air was a solid wall of lead. The will to fight, once fueled by arrogance and power, finally broke. A man emerged from the ditch, his hands held high above his head, his face a mask of terror. Then another. A pistol was thrown from a shattered window, clattering uselessly on the ground. The posse saw this. They saw the surrender, and the roaring of the 60 rifles began to falter. The continuous deafening thunder broke apart, dwindling into a few scattered, angry shots. The hunters were processing the scene, realizing the battle was over. The threat had been neutralized. A few final defiant shots rang out from a die-hard loyalist hiding somewhere in the ruins. They were answered with a concentrated volley, and then a single final crack echoed off the hills. And after it, for the first time in 2 hours, there was nothing. No gunfire, no shouting, just the ringing in 100 ears and the slow, quiet settling of dust. The silence that fell over Morehead was heavier than the noise had been. It was a thick, ringing silence, broken only by the faint crackle of smoldering wood and the drip of water from a punctured rain barrel. For the first time in 2 hours, the town could breathe again. Slowly, hesitantly, the men of the posse began to emerge from their cover. They didn't stand up like triumphant heroes. They rose like men waking from a nightmare, their movements stiff and unsure. Their faces were streaked with sweat and black powder, their eyes wide. There were no cheers of victory. There was no celebration, just the quiet crunch of boots on shattered glass as they began to walk forward, rifles held low. The smoke still hung heavy in the air, a funeral shroud over the street. As it slowly thinned, the full scope of the morning's work was revealed. The Central Hotel was a skeletal ruin, breathing out its last wisps of smoke. The street in front of it was a carpet of debris, splintered wood, brass casings, and broken glass that glittered in the morning sun. And in the silence, the townsfolk began to appear. A curtain would twitch in a window. A cellar door would creak open. People who had been hiding under their beds for 2 hours stepped out onto their porches, their faces pale with shock. They stared at the ruined hotel. They stared at the armed men now standing quietly in the street. And they stared at the still forms lying where they had fallen. Silent witnesses to the brutal, bloody birth of a new order in Rowan County. The posse had won. The tyrant was gone. The reign of terror was over. But as the smoke cleared, a new, unsettling question began to hang in the air, just as thick as the gunpowder had been. What happens now? You have just witnessed 60 men execute the legal authority of their town in broad daylight. You have seen a citizen army overthrow a corrupt government. Was this justice? Or was this just a bigger, more organized murder? The shooting was over. The fight for the story was just beginning. In the quiet aftermath of the battle, Boone, Logan and the leaders of the posse had a new problem. A problem that couldn't be solved with a Winchester rifle. They had to justify what they had just done. Depending on your perspective, they were either heroes or terrorists. They were either liberators who had freed a county from a dictator, or they were a vigilante mob who had just slaughtered the legally appointed officials of their town in a pre-planned ambush. There is no middle ground between those two realities. So they had to choose one and make it stick. They immediately began to frame the narrative. This wasn't a feud. This wasn't revenge. This was a revolution. They didn't call themselves a posse or a mob. They adopted a formal, almost bureaucratic name, the Rowan County Regulators or the Protective Association. It was a brilliant piece of marketing. It sounded official. It sounded civic-minded. It sounded like they were restoring order, not causing chaos. Their argument was simple and powerful. First, they claimed the system had failed them. The courts, the law, the government, all of it had been corrupted by one man, Craig Tolliver. Second, because the system had failed, they argued that the people, the true source of all authority, had the right to take that power back. They weren't breaking the law, they were enforcing a higher law, the law of self-preservation. History is written by the victors, and the victors here were the ones holding the smoking rifles. In the hours after the shootout, they effectively became the new government of Morehead. They disarmed the remaining Tolliver allies. They secured the courthouse. They posted guards. They didn't flee into the hills like outlaws. They stood their ground like a conquering army. To the terrified townsfolk, they presented themselves as the new party of law and order. They promised that the random violence was over, that the reign of fear had ended, that a new era of peace had begun, brought about by 2 hours of absolute carnage. But this carefully crafted story was for local consumption. It worked on the people who had lived under Tolliver's thumb and were relieved to see him gone. The news of this private war, however, travels fast on telegraph wires, and the story was about to arrive on a desk in the state capital of Frankfort. The governor of Kentucky was about to hear that a small army had just executed a county judge, and he would have a very different name for the party of law and order. He would call them murderers. The telegraph in the governor's office in Frankfort began to clatter. The initial reports must have sounded like something from a dime novel, not an official dispatch. A county judge and his deputies killed. The town of Morehead occupied by an armed force of 60 men. The governor was Simon Bolivar Buckner. He was a former Confederate general, a man who understood discipline, order, and the chain of command. His entire worldview was built on the idea that the law was absolute. And now, a report sat on his desk that described the complete and total annihilation of that law in one of his counties. Imagine you are in his position. What do you do? The rule book says your course of action is clear. You declare the county in a state of insurrection. You dispatch the state militia. You order the arrest of Boone, Logan, and every man who fired a rifle that day. You put them on trial for murder, and you hang them. Simple, clean, lawful. But Governor Buckner was also a politician, and he understood the reality on the ground was anything but simple. If he sent the militia, he wouldn't be seen as a hero restoring order. He would be seen as an outsider, using the state's power to punish the very people who had finally stood up to a tyrant the state itself had been unable to control. He would be defending the memory of Craig Tolliver. Worse, what if the Regulators didn't back down? What if they took to the hills and fought back? He would have a full-blown civil war on his hands in eastern Kentucky. The political cost would be catastrophic. The human cost would be even higher. So, he was trapped. Enforce the law and risk a war. Or ignore the law and signal to the entire state that vigilante justice is an acceptable political tool. Buckner chose the path of the politician. He made a show of force, but he avoided a real confrontation. He sent a small contingent of militia not to fight, but to observe and to negotiate. He publicly condemned the violence, using strong words about law and order. But behind the scenes, the real message was clear. Handle this quietly. Make it go away. No one was ever seriously prosecuted for the events of June 22, 1887. The local grand jury, made up of friends and neighbors of the posse, refused to issue any indictments. The case just faded away. The state of Kentucky blinked. The official, written law had been broken. But the unwritten law of the hills had been satisfied. And in the end, that was the only law that seemed to matter. The feud was technically over, but the scars left on the town and on the idea of justice itself were just beginning to form. The militia came and went. The reporters packed up their notebooks and left. The story of the Battle of Morehead faded from the front pages, replaced by new headlines and new tragedies. And the town of Morehead was left alone with its ghosts. On the surface, the Regulators had achieved their goal. The random violence that had plagued the county for years was over. The surviving members of the Tolliver faction either fled or fell silent, their power broken forever. People could finally walk the streets without looking over their shoulder. But was it peace? Or was it just exhaustion? The town was forever changed. It now carried a reputation. Bloody Rowan, they called it. A place where men settled their differences, not in a courtroom, but with a small army and 100 rounds a minute. That stigma, that shadow, would hang over the community for generations. The empty plot of land where the Central Hotel once stood became a scar on the town's geography, a constant silent reminder of the day the war came home. For the men who pulled the triggers, life moved on, but the memory remained. They went back to their farms. They raised their families. They became respected elders in the community. But they were always the men who had been in the hills that day. They carried the weight of what they had done, a quiet understanding that passed between them in a nod or a look. The Battle of Morehead was a brutal, bloody climax. It was the high watermark of the Kentucky feud era. The sheer scale of it, the organization, the military precision of the ambush sent a shockwave through the Appalachians. It was a demonstration of what happened when the cycle of an eye for an eye was allowed to escalate to its logical, terrifying conclusion. It was a war so total, so absolute, that it seemed to burn the very idea of feuding out of the local culture. They had won. They had taken back their homes. They had removed a tyrant. But the method they used left a permanent, troubling question mark hovering over the hills of Kentucky. A question that haunts us to this day when we look at this story. They had achieved a good end, but they had done it through terrible means. And it forces us to ask, what is the true cost of buying peace with violence? We started this story in a storm of gunfire with a simple, confusing premise. The lawmen were the villains, and the outlaws were the heroes. After 2 hours of chaos and a street littered with the consequences, the people of Morehead, Kentucky, made their choice. They sided with the men holding the 60 Winchester rifles, and history, for the most part, has sided with them too. But the story of Craig Tolliver's fall is a dangerous one. It's a dark mirror that forces us to look at the very foundation of our society. We build systems of law to protect us from the rule of the strongest. We agree to give up a piece of our freedom in exchange for order. But the Rowan County War shows us what happens when that system fails. When the shield becomes a sword. When the institution designed to protect the people begins to prey on them instead. It's easy to sit here, over a century later, and see the clean lines of the story. Tolliver was a tyrant. Boone, Logan, and his Regulators were liberators. But on that June morning, they weren't characters in a history book. They were men, backed into a corner, who made a terrible choice. They decided that the law was no longer their shield, so they would forge their own justice out of gunpowder and lead. And that leaves us with a final, terrifying question. One that is just as relevant today as it was in 1887. If the system that is supposed to dispense justice fails you completely and utterly, do you have the right to become the justice yourself? Or does that choice, no matter how necessary it feels in the moment, simply start the cycle all over again and make you the next monster?